Welcome to Management Science 352 Operations Management. Intro time. So the introduction version where we sort of look at the course from a very high level and see how all the components are tied together, and then we start to delve into the details. The reason for this is sometimes when we're delving into those details, it's easy to lose perspective. Sometimes you just need to take a step back and see, hey, look, that's kind of cool as to how all the parts are actually moving together. And then you get into the weeds and sometimes you lose a little bit of perspective. Okay, so here, high level stuff, do the intro, see how things all tie together at the very high level before we get too detailed and we run the risk of losing perspective. Okay, so a couple of kind of important things as to why we care about the topics in this particular course. One of the topics in this particular course deals with waiting lines. Now, we've all waited in line. We typically don't like it. Right? Slide there says 37 billion hours Americans spend waiting in line. You'll probably be able to reduce that by 10 and say it's probably typical for Canadians as well. I mean, now, in the midst of the COVID virus, perhaps we're waiting in line just a little bit less, or waiting at a very long socially distanced line. One or the other, right? And so we're going to use statistical modeling, right, based on your experience in your first stats class, in order to kind of see, how long typical waits are, how many people would we expect to be in the line, and then start to talk about ways that we can improve those lines. There are line structures that are worse than others, right? Not all lines are created equal. Okay? And we'll see that in that particular unit. Now, it's really easy because, of course, we have personal experience waiting in line. It's easy to forget that things can wait in line. Right? An assembly line where all of a sudden part of the assembly line is stopped because another subsequent part of the assembly line is moving slower than expected, or something has broken down. That's a waiting line too, right? Whether we're making cheese and we have a cheese assembly line, and all of a sudden that assembly line is starting to back up at a certain point, that's still a waiting line. The cheese is in the waiting line, or the iPhone is in the waiting line, or the Kindle is in the waiting line, or my monitor, is in the waiting line. So lots of things can be in waiting lines as well. Okay, we tend to talk about waiting lines in the personal context because it's more relatable, but that doesn't mean that it's the only context. Fun thing about waiting lines is we also talk not just about the mathematics of it, but the psychology of it, which I really like. It's my favorite component of operations management, because you sort of work on both sides of your brain. You start thinking from the human psychological angle. You're also thinking from that mathematical angle, and then you're kind of bringing them together. It's kind of cool. I like it. Another very important component of the course, probably the most important, because everything else sort of depends on and ties back to forecasting. Everything depends on our forecast. And when we talk about this in our course, right, we're not going to just limit forecasts. Sometimes it's, the bean counters take over, and you got the modeling, and you got this, and you got that, and you got some really cool statistical stuff going on. And hey, I love cool statistical stuff, no doubt about that. However, it's not the only thing in forecasting. We also have qualitative factors that we'll also talk about. Okay. And especially when you're starting to talk about new business development, new venture development, there's not hard data in order to base those forecasts on, and you do depend on those qualitative forecasts. It's not necessarily to say that they're bad. We just have to accept the limitations of both procedures, and they both have limitations, trust me. And you'll see those limitations as we get into those units. But it's very important to get that forecast down, because Again, everything else depends on those forecasts. So there's a nice little snippet of info there. 20% reduction in forecast errors can result in a 1% improvement in the revenue that the revenue management system for an airline provides. That's actually 1%. You go 1%, oh, big whoop, right? Go look. Before 2020, go look at the 2019 numbers for an airline and see how much 1% in revenue is. It's big. It's huge. Right? There's a lot of dough there. So very important to get those forecasts out, because when we make when the forecast is out, all our resource sort of allocations, all our planning centers around what we think sales will be, or how much we will sell in the next quarter, the next year, or the next week. Right? If that's out, that means we may have over-allocated resources, we may have under-allocated resources. Both are bad. Right? If we over-allocate, well, it means, oh my gosh, we didn't need to put so much there. We could have put those resources somewhere else and made a bunch of money. Or we just wasted them. Right? Waste is very bad. Or we underallocated and we missed sales. Wow, man, I wish we would have put more resources dedicated to that particular product line. That thing really just took off. Who saw that coming? And you go, oh no, right? Lost sales. That stings too. Right. Okay, so we're going to talk about what is operations management. Good to kind of know since we named the course after it, right? We'll talk about a little bit of performance dimensions. Now, when we talk about performance dimensions, not necessarily mean to be comprehensive in all this, okay? So it's just to sort of get a sense or a flow for what those possible performance dimensions are. It's not to negate something that you didn't see in another class, whether it's a supply chain class, or even if it's a managerial accounting class, or it's a finance class, right? We can pull performance dimensions from a whole host of fields. We're not just limited to performance dimensions that might be mentioned in an operations management course, right? And we can bring in our whole experience, and it converges into this one bigger topic. We'll talk a little bit about business strategy, just to kind of put things in context. I'm not going to try to confuse this with Business 450 or something like that, where it's it's a strategy class, but just to kind of the business strategy of the overall organization is important. Okay, and we'll distinguish that from an operations strategy. Okay. And a little bit about the coordination of the two strategies, not super details in the sense that we'll talk about a lot of principles here, but we want to keep it in our mind when we analyze situations as to what those things are and how they maybe come together. Okay. Oh my goodness, you look at that slide and you go, oh, I'm dizzy. Whoa, violates pretty much every PowerPoint rule known to humans. Yes, I know, way too many words. I'm not even going to pretend to read off of that thing. You can use it as reference, but essentially we have functional organizations, or functional departments, HR, accounting, finance, engineering perhaps, sales or marketing. Google follows somewhat of a functional department organization. And then we have sort of parts of the organization that do the doing, or the day-to-day, what we call day-to-day execution, the actual meat and potatoes of the product development, the actual detailed steps, detailed processes is probably a better word, detailed processes that going into the provision of a particular product or a particular service. And that's where we're going to zero in on, is that operations management, the actual process or procedures or organization of the production or the provision of a particular product or a particular service. Okay, so again, we're predominantly involved in the doing part, quotation marks or air things, whatever you call them. And we're involved in the doing, but we also want to make sure we're doing that doing part as efficiently and as effectively. Effectively is probably the most important word, because it means we're actually doing it that well. Efficiency can be a little bit of a misnomer and can be a little misleading sometimes. Okay? But we want to look at what's the best way to carry out a process. We'll talk about some measurements of that best way to carry out a process, but again, this course starts you out. This is not the limitation of your potential learning. This is just a little toe dip into the lake, right? We're just getting a little taste here. And each one of these topics that we'll talk about, holy cow, just a huge topic in and of itself, okay? And so we're just going to gain an appreciation for all these important topics, and you can carry forward all these important topics, not just to strictly, oh, well, I'm not going to be in supply chain, so I really don't give a hoot about this stuff. I mean, it's a mandatory class, and I'm taking it, and then after that, I'm, close that chapter of my life and move on with something else. No. Okay, no. Whether you're in HR, whether you're in marketing, you're pulling out a lot of these tools in your particular field. So a lot of these operations, if your doing is hiring people, that's your operation, right? And if your operation is hiring people, well, you're in HR, you're thinking, op management doesn't apply to me. I'm an HR person, I don't do this stuff. You got a forecast. You got to have a forecast. How do you plan your hiring process? Right? If you don't know or have an idea of how many people you need to hire. Right? So it all starts off with that forecast. And that's whether you're hiring people, whether you're selling stuff. Clearly with marketing and sales, forecasts are very important. You need to ensure that you're prepared or can handle the sales that you expect. Obviously, if you're manufacturing something, the forecast becomes very important, because you need to make sure that you've procured all the necessary resources, whether those resources are, machinery, equipment, humans, or raw materials, whatever it may be. It starts off with that forecast as to how much you expect that you will sell, then therefore how much you expect of those resources you'll need to fulfill that potential or that forecasted sales. So again, all starts with the forecast. And you can kind of see where if that forecast is wrong, it really ripples all the way through the organization, and in a negative way. But if it's right, if it's so right, oh man, the payback is huge. Yeah. And then we kind of move into project management. We've said, okay, maybe our forecast has shown something. We should develop this particular market a little bit more. And so we set up another facility. You're setting up a facility, that's a project, right? Your project is we're setting up a new facility. And project management's kind of neat, because it's fun, because you get to organize all the pieces and all the components to building something. It's tangible, it's as tangible as we get in, an academic environment. You're playing with the pieces of the activities and organizing the activities, and you can kind of see the project from beginning to end, and you see the flow of activities, and it's all pretty kind of cool, right? It's very organization-y. So if you have, even a hint of supply chain, or a hint of management, or a hint of accounting, even, right? You like keeping track of all that stuff. So kind of fun there. And examples of projects, again, doesn't have to be necessarily a big, doing a facility where it's a huge project. It can be small projects. It can be a reno. My daughter works in project management, and her projects can range from remodeling all the washrooms in elementary schools to building a fire hall in Grand Cache. So it can run the gambit of small projects to the big projects. Right? The big projects get all our attention. That doesn't mean the small projects are not important too. And we'll talk about project scheduling and cost crashing, or crashing a project. The crashing a project will be the part that sometimes gets a little can be hairy for some people, or hard. And then we move into what's called constraint management, right? And so we're organizing our resources. Well, our goal essentially is, and I know I violated that PowerPoint rule twice already. That's a wordy PowerPoint, but in case you want to kind of look back at it later, have at it, go for it, enjoy. But essentially, constraint management is now we're trying to make something. And we're trying to make something such that we sort of make what we have in the most efficient way possible. Efficiency can come in two flavors. It can be we're trying to maximize profit, however it is measured, or we're trying to minimize costs. And typically I'm an economist, so we sort of see them as the same issue. Okay, so we may want to minimize our resources or maximize some other performance dimension or performance or profits. Right? So we're not limited to that performance dimension being profits. It often is, because it's a easier to measure and visualize sort of metric, but it's not limited to just maximizing profit. It can be maximizing another performance dimension. Again, it really goes to the overall strategy of the company. So we have our sequence of events, and we've organized them, and we're building something, we're making something, and we're just trying to ensure that we're making the most efficient things, right? The things that are most appropriate to the organization. Maximize some good performance dimension. And then we delve into this idea of a bottleneck. That activity or that part of the production of a good or service that is limiting us improving that important performance dimension even more. Right? And we want to zero in on this thing called a bottleneck, because it's the thing that's holding us back. It's the constraint that's limiting all the goodness that we want to bring. Right? Whether that goodness is profits or that goodness is minimizing cost or minimizing emissions and so on. Again, could be a whole variety of performance dimensions. Okay, so we focus in on that bottleneck, and we improve that bottleneck. And this improve the bottleneck, process, which we'll call the theory of constraints. That's an ongoing, continual improvement process, because once we improve one bottleneck, typically another one appears. Okay. It's kind of fun. Hey, makes life worth living, right? There's always a challenge out there. Great stuff. All right, inventory management. Ooh, big one here. This one's fun from a actual point of view, because we've all gone to buy something and found out that it's not there. And an interesting statistic is that 95% of the time, when someone goes to a shop and they can't find the thing they're looking for, they don't go back and buy it later. Wow, I read that and I go, whoa, 95% of the time, if you don't have it, person just goes away, never comes back looking for it again. Oh, wow, right? So this inventory management, it's a big deal. Right? We want to make sure we're balancing two trade-offs here with inventory management. We want to make sure, we don't want those 95% of those people that don't see it on the shelves and leave and never come back. We don't want that. But on the other hand, we don't want to be stuck with a bunch of inventory we can't sell either. Right? So we're having these two balancing acts. And you'll see this will be we'll have two mantras in our whole world in this course. One is trade-offs. We're always making a trade-off, and that is the way the real world works. There's always a trade-off. There's never a one-sided, we're only going to focus in on one factor. We can either make it small, we can make it big, and that's it. It's always a trade-off, because when you focus on this, it means you're not focusing on something else. When you make something a priority, that means you've made something else not a priority. Okay? Always a trade-off. And the second thing, our nemesis, variability, makes a mess out of everything. You try to get up a forecast, all of a sudden demand varies. Why? We don't know. Could be anything. Could be a pandemic, right? Who would have seen that coming? Right? Probably not in a whole lot of forecasts. In fact, I don't think it was in anybody's forecasts that they could establish. They said it before 2020. So, right? Variability kills us in our forecasts. Variability kills us in our constraint management. We got a machine pumping out a certain amount all the time, but if it's got a lot of variability, then maybe it's pumping out more, it's producing more, maybe it's producing less. That producing more, producing less, then can create a problem further in the production process or the service provision process. So variability sort of focuses in on everywhere. Now, why do I care about this in inventory management? Is because sometimes if demand is higher than expected, we may run out of stuff. Right? Why? Why was demand higher than expected? It's variability. Demand is lower than expected. Now we're stuck with all this inventory that we may have to sell at a discount. Why? Variability. And the reasons for variability can be things that we can maybe improve our models to predict, and it just might be random too. So lots of really important business issues flowing through here. And then waiting lines. And we'll talk about waiting lines. And again, just like when I was emphasizing it at the beginning, is waiting lines, we relate it to us in a waiting line, but it could be things in that waiting line too. And so we don't want to be too limiting, but yes, we'll talk about people in a waiting line more because it's relatable and it's easier to learn that, and it's easier for it to stick in your head that way. And so I make a sacrifice for the educational pedagogy. I hate the word pedagogy, to be quite honest with you, but just for the sort of the educational aspect of it, we'll focus in on a little bit how waiting lines affect you as a human, but understand that it can be extended to things as well. Okay. And again, nice blend of psychology as well as mathematics in that particular unit, which is very, very, very nice. It gives us a little bit of everything. Okay. But why do waiting lines develop? Because we're providing a service, and for some reason we're not able to meet all the demand that requires the service at some point in time. Well, why aren't we able to meet the demand? Well, we didn't see this much people coming at this point in time. So forecasting was messed up, right? And it could be, right? I mean, so you can kind of see forecasting, it's like everywhere. Nobody appreciates it, but looms its large head pretty much all throughout every unit that we do. You point and say, hey, oh man, if you'd only forecasted better, this wouldn't have happened. Now, there's a limit, right? I mean, we're always, when we say, hey, could have forecasted better, there's a cost to that. And sometimes, again, we make a trade-off, right? We can only spend so much time doing forecasting, but eventually we got to spend some time doing some profit-making activities. Otherwise, we're all going to be unemployed, but we'll have a great forecast. The forecast will be that it's zero and that we all don't have jobs. So we always have that trade-off. We need a timely forecast. We need a forecast that doesn't cost us a whole lot of money, especially the timely forecast part. And so there's trade-offs when we have that particular requirement. All right, so business strategy, as you probably are already aware or will be aware, it's just more of a long-term perspective as to where we see the company going or the company being. Okay. It can be controversial in that some folks will look at it more in the, hey, they have sort of a detailed strategy and it's all beautiful and it's all wrapped up, and then some organizations will have a very, very loose strategy. They sort of have a more of an idea of this is who we are and this is where we're headed, and if it conforms with who we are and where we're headed, we're good to go that way. But we could change exactly some of the markets or the directions we're going, but we're always going to hold sort of fast to who we are and what we're able to do. And a lot of tech companies sort of hold fast to that because it's really becomes really hard to say, well, where do you see tech in 10 years? Who the heck knows, right? I mean, you can make a forecast, you can see your strategy as to where that goes, but really, do you think, is it going to be there? Who knows, right? I work I'm a chair of a nonprofit called Ford Air Partnership, and just before 2020 we did sort of a Vision 2030 thing, our strategic planning to see where we're going to go. Now we do ambient air, that's the air that is in the community, the air that people actually breathe. Okay, ambient air quality in the northeast area of Edmonton and Fort Saskatchewan, parts of Strathcona County, parts of Sturgeon County, and parts of Lamont County, and so on. And we monitor that air quality. Now, ours is fairly stable because there's a long-term horizon for many of the plants that are in this area. There will still be rolling in 2030. They'll still be emitting something in 2030. Exactly how much? Don't know, right? So that's somewhat fluid for us. Will there be more or less? Again, somewhat fluid, but there's such a long time horizon in those projects that we sort of see it coming from a far ways. And in that regard, okay, we do a strategic planning session. We can have a perspective of where we think things will be in 10 years. That's okay, right? It's probably going to be fairly stable or within sort of predictable limits. But however, if new startup, very fluid industry, that may be harder to get too detailed in the business strategy. Okay. And of course, your operations management strategy has to support that. Who are you? What business are you in? Where are you headed? And then the operations strategy is, okay, what are the tangible things that you're going to do to get there? Right, what are you going to make and how are you going to make it? And how are you going to source your materials? And then how are you going to make sure that you have the appropriate mix of people to carry that out? All that on the operations side. Okay, so the strategy, 3 key principles. I won't go through this in too much detail. Creation of a unique and valuable position involving a different set of activities, so few needs of many customers is one potential strategy. Loop City or many of the oil change places follow that they're not going to necessarily do a transmission rebuild, but they are going to do your basic routine maintenance services. Serving broad needs of a few customers, private banking in that regard. Serving broad needs of many customers in a narrow market. That could be a tricky one. That almost seems like an oxymoron. So that one's pretty hard. You could maybe look at some legal services might fall in that, where you have I try to think of a law firm that can handle many customers, so they have maybe a broad civil area, but they specialize in a certain segment of it, but they can do a whole bunch of other things. That's kind of neat. That one seems kind of academic-ish to me, but whatever. 2. Trade-offs. Again, everything is trade-offs and variability. That's basically, there's our mission statement for this course. How do we deal with trade-offs and variability? And that's it. could be the one learning outcome in all this. Can you deal with trade-offs and variability? Yes or no? And how do you do it? Okay. So trade-offs. Sometimes that trade-offs is what should you do. It's also what you shouldn't do. Or maybe you should do nothing. That's the hardest one of them all. Is maybe you shouldn't do anything. We are victims as humans. We are victims of do-something-ism. We have to do something. And sometimes the appropriate thing is to not do anything at this moment, is to wait, to be patient. Oh, trust me, I've been in this having to be patient, wait for things to develop. It is the hardest thing in the world to do, right? Actually, doing something hard is easier than waiting to do something at the appropriate time. That's what I find. Okay, so there's an example there as to trade-offs and what you ought not do. Maytag is kind of an example, but business is littered with all sorts of entities that have tried things and done things poorly. Retailer J.C. Penney's in the United States is really extended this. Sears in Canada has really made these kind of mistakes. Sears decided to go out of hardware and into fashion because, hey, fashion had the big margins. Hardware didn't have the big margins. Let's go to the big margin, the glitzy area. But it turns out fashion is very fickle, and it's got its own sort of pitfalls, I guess you'd say, and yet appliances and hardware turns out very stable, hence why Home Depot and companies like that went into hardware, and not hardware, but it went into more consumer durables like washing machines and fridges and so on, because although there's a relatively low margin, it's very stable, right? It's always a flow of people buying those things. And so sometimes, lower margin, but more stability. Again, less variability. That's a positive attribute. Fit. Don't try to be what you're not. Right? If you have the mix of people in the corporate culture to do one thing, to turn that around, to try to do something else, often ends in tears and heartbreak. It just doesn't work. The example here is Continental versus Southwest Airlines in the United States. Southwest is sort of is a discount airline. Doesn't do the hub and spoke kind of doesn't do hub and spoke like other airlines. So it's like Delta and American Airlines and Air Canada do, where you kind of fly to a hub and then from the hub you go to maybe a smaller location. They just fly straight one place to the other. They might do a sequence of it. So, for instance, they might go from Houston to Las Vegas to Los Angeles, but it'll be kind of a straight line there, and be pretty much a straight line back. And they don't do this go from hub to hub, and then from a hub to a smaller community. And so Continental tried to imitate that, because Southwest, up until, again, everything here with airlines is prefaced pre-2020, right? Up until 2020, very, very profitable airline, consistently profitable, right? I mean, they really have a tight operations management structure, though, because they really flow on being cost. Flying Southwest is like taking a Greyhound. It is bare bones stuff. Right? There's no fancy, there's no glitz, there's no champagne on the flight, that kind of stuff. And so that's a particular management strategy, particular operations strategy, particular business strategy that their culture is suited to do. I mean, they've hired people based on that kind of a culture, right? They've selected their employees based on that is the culture that we operate. So the employees, that's the culture that they're accustomed to. That's the culture that works for them. To take an airline like Continental and then try to make it into Southwest, well, you didn't hire Southwest-like people, right? And so it was doomed to fail. And guess what? Unfortunately, it did. Okay. Added notes, not that big a deal. So two broad generic strategies. Cost leadership, differentiation. You'll see this when you take Business 450. There's a particular simulation that you'll do. It depends. Maybe you won't be doing it anymore, or maybe I'll just say it has been done and may be done in the future. And you sort of pick which kind of company you are. Are you the cost leadership, or that operations management's got to be tight? You got to run a very lean system, right? Minimize waste in that system in order to take on cost leadership. Differentiation, this is where you maybe have to be a little bit more creative in the product design. Cost leadership, you may have to be very creative in the how you actually make the product. Differentiation, you're a little bit more creative in what that product is and how it's designed. So lots of examples here. Low-cost operations. We know Costco, we know Walmart. Quality, Rolex, consistent quality. McDonald's, whether you like the level of quality, that's a different thing. But let's face it, McDonald's has the system, and it's consistent. Great movie I enjoyed watching. A fair treatment of McDonald's, and Ray Kroc is the founder, starring Michael Keaton. Pretty good movie. I think it's been on one of the streaming services. I can't remember if it's Amazon or Netflix, but very good business movie. It's got some drama in there too, because of course it's got to appeal to a wider audience. But it's actually a pretty good business movie. Service quality, Apple Store, iGenius, or the Apple Geniuses and stuff like that. Delivery speed, Dell, I don't know if it's Dell anymore. On-time delivery, I will say UPS. I'll say UPS pre-pandemic. I do get deliveries from, one of my companies gets deliveries from UPS regularly. Up until March of 2020, great. You got something coming out of the States to Edmonton, it's 1 week. 1 week, 1 week, 1 week. Consistent, very little variability unless there's a huge snowstorm. 2020, everything was freaking upside down. Now, you know what? You send something UPS, you get it when you get it. They give you an initial a date. I haven't, every time that's been changed and rearranged, and it's a mess right now. But used to be UPS for on-time delivery. Development speed, so Zara. I actually went and saw one in, I can't remember if it's in Vegas and Los Angeles, and essentially their claim to fame is they can go from actually designing a fashion to getting it on the shelves in like 9 days or something like that. Crazy fast, right? So they can go from visualizing a particular blouse or shirt. I think it's mostly directed to women. A blouse, shirt, dress, and actually making it and having it on the shelves in 9 days. So that is amazing speed. So very fast. Customization, Ritz-Carlton, never been. They don't pay me that much here, but it's a very high-end hotel, and a lot of service staff there to make sure that each customer going to the Ritz-Carlton has certain expectations and certain needs, and the Ritz-Carlton tries to meet each one's individual service needs. Variety, of course. Amazon, volume, UPS. You could also even put Canada Post in the volume, or the U.S. Postal Service in there as well. Okay. So again, that operation strategy is sort of how do we align how we're going to do all this stuff. So we've decided that we're in a particular segment. How do we bring all this together? How do we actually produce or provide that particular service or product? How is that done? That's our operation strategy. Okay, so we have our production and inventory strategies. We can make to stock, we can make to order, we can assemble to order. Right? Depends on the situation, depends on the level of customization that we're providing. Right? Make to stock just means, hey, everyone's getting the same thing. Make to order means each one is customized to a particular person or particular organization. And then assemble to order means, we're somewhat in between, right? There's some flexibility, but we have, a certain limited choices. For instance, you could order a car, but the basics of the car will be very similar. You'll have maybe 1 or 2 engine choices, some interior, entertainment choices, maybe only 1, 2 or 3 entertainment choices as far as your entertainment system and so on, right? So there'll be like limited models and limited flexibility within there, but some flexibility. Equipment necessary for the operations of the business, so you gotta make sure you have the necessary equipment. If you're providing more of a general services, you have general all-purpose equipment versus, let's say, specialized equipment, which may be more efficient for producing one particular thing, but can only be used for that one particular thing. Okay. Now, facility layouts, and we'll talk about this a little bit, and that'll wrap up our little chit chat here, which has gone on quite long right now. So this mostly relates to constraint management, and it's not necessarily meant to be super comprehensive, but it sort of gives us an idea of when we start to brainstorm how to arrange a certain process, or even, for that matter, how to arrange a waiting line. Right? We can think of these kinds of things. So one of the facility layouts we have, and I believe we have 3 of them, is a product layout. And that's sort of our standard, that's our typical assembly line. Right? The product flows from one point, then it goes to the next station, then it goes to the next station, it goes to the next station, and so on until it's done. And auto plants work that way, a cafeteria works that way, and it's very efficient for moving a lot of product through, but it is somewhat limited in that it can only deal with those limited choices. So it has a certain level of inflexibility to it, because you're producing a certain product. It's really hard to retool the line to produce another product. So it can produce a lot. It's great for mass production, not so much for flexibility. So if you have stable demand, it's great. If you have very highly fluctuating demand, not so great, because again, it doesn't have that flexibility to deal with changing from one product to another product, or maybe even ramping it up or ramping down, increasing or decreasing the amount it does produce. Process layout. So for instance, if you're making bumpers, let's say we're making bumpers in a car. That assembly line, it goes from one step to the next step, and then boom, it's out, right? However, the tool and the die, right, the stamping of that bumper, so the equipment, the tools or the casts used to actually make that bumper, well, that was done by the process layout, right? Very highly customized product. So the making of the bumper itself is not highly customized, but the initial design and the making of the die or the tools necessary to make that particular bumper can be very specialized. Right? University departments follow a process layout. We deal with sort of highly fluid situation. Our equipment is general purpose. Who knows what questions you're going to ask when you come into my office, should you ever be allowed to come into the office again. So we, as me as an instructor, we provide somewhat of a highly customized product in smaller quantities. With all these video clips, we're kind of becoming a little less customized. However, there are help sessions, which are a good way to customize this particular product. Okay. And so this one, flexible situation, flexible people, flexible equipment. Yeah. What do I got? I have a laptop, I have a computer monitor, I have a desk, some shelves, and a chair. Right? Very general purpose equipment. And I'll put some pictures up eventually on the website of a tool and die shop making the fronts of subway cars. Right? And it's, you can see it's very, very specialized process. It's not really an assembly. Lot of high skilled, very flexible labor, doing one thing in one context, and then perhaps they're doing something else in another context, and everything is a customized product. Fixed position layout, that's where the product stays and you move around it, you the worker. Right? House, building, that new SAMU building, that was fixed position, right? Construction people come in, trades people come in, put the building together, but the building doesn't move anywhere, right? It's fixed. People don't like it when buildings move. It's considered bad. Okay. And cellular layout is just sort of a blend of the bunch, right? It's usually a blend of the process layout and the product layout. Okay? So you have maybe a little bit of a process or sort of a process in the making of a certain component, but then that component goes into the overall assembly line and is used in the more assembly line kind of process. So the provision of the component itself might use a process layout, and then that component then goes into more of an assembly line kind of layout, and the final product comes from there. Okay? So a lot of cars, if you're creating an assembly, or maybe you're building an alternator, something like that, and then it goes into the overall assembly line. And then last, strategic alignment. Again, being mindful, everything has to flow together. What you are making, how you are making it, what your strategy for making it is, has to align with that overall business strategy. If you're a low-cost producer, then your operations management has to reflect the fact that managing costs and being efficient is very important. If you're more of a creative, product differentiation kind of company, well, maybe the strict cost management isn't what you're trying to do. Flexibility is what's very important to you. So again, all about those trade-offs. And that was a long one. That was a long clip. Feel free to, hopefully, if you got to watch it in little brief chinks and chunks, that's great too. Okay, if you have any questions, you're always welcome to ask. Thank you very much.